All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Gridiron Gridlocks with your host, Trevor. We have some fantastic games for you guys this week in Conference Championship weekend. It's been a hectic evening, I would say, for the most part, lining up to that matchup, ladies and gentlemen. From the Sun Belt Championship game with James Madison taking care of business and Tulane and North Texas battling it out Friday night as well, ladies and gentlemen. But with Tulane getting the victory of 34-21, ladies and gentlemen, the playoff committee has been sitting together since Friday, watching all these conference championship games, trying to figure out the 5 highest ranked conference champions to get into the college football playoffs, ladies and gentlemen. Not an easy task, definitely very difficult to pull off, ladies and gentlemen. But we start breaking down the analytics to figure out who belongs, who gets left out, what scenarios we need to figure out who gets into the college football playoffs. Are teams safe? If you're idle this weekend, is that enough to keep you in the playoffs, or does that bump you out? Does playing conference championships add a greater value of punishing you if you lose as a one-loss team? Or do you get to slip in losing? The question is, how do you lose? Can you figure out how to skate by a conference championship? Do you purposely lose rivalry weekend and not play in your conference championship weekend? A lot of things to decide here on Gridiron Gridlocks, ladies and gentlemen. But let's do a quick recap of last night's games. I was watching the James Madison-Troy game. It started out a little bit sluggish for James Madison, and ladies and gentlemen, it wasn't a clear, decisive victory until later in the game. But at one point, it was like 17-14 late in the third. It wasn't such a huge margin where James Madison came out. Obviously, the student section was not liking some of the calls, and they were throwing snowballs. And the athletic director came on saying, "You cannot be throwing snowballs. It will be a penalty against James Madison," ladies and gentlemen. And that's what they went. They were trying to keep the snowballs at bay from bad calls from what the refs were dealing with. But James Madison took care of business. Now, for them to get into the college football playoffs, they need some help from the ACC. They need Duke to win. But I think we have the question is, if Duke wins, it's how they win. That's what we're going to look into. If Duke wins, does that give them enough way to get in? Let's say, as an example, does a 4 touchdown favorite going in to beat what am I thinking of? Virginia in this matchup enough to get in? They're not ranked. James Madison's ranked. Tulane survives, and North Texas loses their rank. So technically, you're moving at least James Madison up one position to number 24 in the nation for the ranks. At least that. But is it enough? Does winning your conference championship for James Madison move them closer to Tulane and have them sit, I don't know, like 21? But if Virginia loses their rank, they'll probably bump up Tulane, and that will probably pull up James Madison. But then like I say, when you look at Duke playing in that ACC championship game, and if they were won in a dominant fashion, is that good? But keep in mind, Duke and Virginia have already played each other this year, and that score was 34-17 in Virginia's favor. Basically, 17 points Duke trailed by the end of that game. Is that winning that game, like today, in the ACC championship game, and not going behind like 17 points, but like they win by like 28, or they win by 35? Like, is that enough to claw them out from being a non-ranked team, getting past James Madison and getting in? It's a weird hypothetical that looms large, and we don't get that clear cut, ladies and gentlemen. The ACC championship game falls at the same time as the Big Ten championship game. So you might have two TVs watching between Indiana and Ohio State and Duke and Virginia to see how that shakes up. I want the drama, so I'm kind of rooting for Duke, but I know that Virginia's going to take care of business. They already got the head-to-head, but Virginia, you don't know what Virginia team you are going to get. They go into overtime against North Carolina, where Duke dominates North Carolina. So it's like there's a huge problem going back and forth looking at the ACC. There's no consistency on top of that. But to make matters worse, ladies and gentlemen, it's that signature win. Obviously, it puts the bet to rest for James Madison. If Virginia wins, Virginia goes in probably as the 4, and then we'll probably play Ole Miss. But, ladies and gentlemen, when you look at that, Tulane will play against Oregon on the road at Oregon, which is not looking good. You would rather deal with Ole Miss, most likely. Going with the whole coaching change, players' attitudes and emotions might be different with Lane Kiffin leaving. And they're trying to make a statement saying that we can try to make a deep run in the playoffs. We don't need Lane Kiffin to get the job done. Like, it's one of those things that have a large impact for that program. And if I was Tulane, like you're also kind of rooting for Duke to win, so you can get that chaos within Ole Miss and going through. Because I think whoever gets that coveted, 11th seed going 11-6 matchup, you might have a chance to stun them and get into, a possible, 3 matchup. I want to say. And that depends on how the SEC championship game shakes out, which, ladies and gentlemen, is another can of worms that we will have to dive into. But there's just another game that leads up to like the noon kickoff hour, ladies and gentlemen, with BYU and Texas Tech. But I want to wrap up the scenario that we got going on with the ACC and the Sun Belt. What has to happen? James Madison didn't put up a show that was respectable until late in the game to give him that 31-14 victory. Like, if they came out dominating through and Duke ended up winning, that would have been fine. But you got to look out 4 quarters worth of football to decide who goes in. Because if a team, you look at the end of the score and the game starts being a runaway factor, that will unravel on how people start to look at how they played the first 3 quarters. And when you look at the first 3 quarters of the Troy and James Madison game, it's a completely different script, how it was close. James Madison couldn't pull away. And it was just one of those things until late in the 4th. Well, in the beginning of the 4th, that's when James Madison started to pull away. But that kind of leads their story. Their story is now set. Now they have to wait for help to get the job done. But Tulane on their front came out, really kind of took care of business against North Texas. I thought North Texas was going to have a dominating fashion victory since they were keeping teams at bay, having a great year, but they fell short. I think it was like a little too late for their siege, and their final score was 34-21. Now let's get to, ladies and gentlemen, the Big 12 kickoff. At noon. It's high noon. It's literally a showdown in the Big 12. But the discussion that sits at large is, why is BYU in the middle of Notre Dame and Miami? And their only loss is to number 4 Texas Tech, and they're sitting out at number 11. Let that sink in for a little bit, ladies and gentlemen. Sinking in to the realization where the committee is putting a buffer team between Notre Dame and Miami with BYU. And if BYU wins the Big 12 championship game, they move ahead over Notre Dame, and Notre Dame gets left out. For Notre Dame to get back into the discussion, they have the head-to-head problem with Miami. And if Alabama loses the SEC championship game, now you're comparing apples to apples because the teams actually played each other. I don't think you can leave Miami out when they have head-to-head. Now, if you get left out and you have the head-to-head, Committee, please make it make sense. Where if you actually play the team in that year and you don't get into the playoff field, and that's like separating you from being a bubble team on the outside looking in, then at that point, why even schedule to play each other if you know that your head to head doesn't matter? That is a thing that we're going to have to figure out in this matchup if Alabama loses in the SEC championship game. Because what's going to end up happening if BYU loses to Texas Tech, Miami moves up, and there's now next to Notre Dame. I don't think you can get around the idea of having the head-to-head and saying that it's a different team. Sure, from the beginning of the season to where they are now, the teams have made improvements. But still, at the same time, if we're looking at the tape, Miami dominated Notre Dame that game. It wasn't like, oh, it's like the first week they're a little bit sluggish and all that stuff. It was a clear domination victory for Miami. I don't think we saw what Notre Dame could deal with. It was a physical matchup for Miami. They took care of business. And now they sit below Notre Dame. I think it's a brand thing. It's a brand issue. We've seen that the entire year with Indiana. If they were a football blue-blooded name, they could possibly be the number one team in the country over Ohio State. Let's change like Indiana. If they were Notre Dame, another school in Indiana, and it's same vicinity, but they have the brand name like Notre Dame. I kid you not, Indiana would be the number one team in the country. They have the better record, not the better record, the better resume win. But even though Ohio State played Texas week 1, but only beat Texas by 7, and that was week 1. And then they had their ranked 15 matchup against Michigan at the end of the year, beat them convincingly, only gave up field goals in that game, and they're still number one. But if that was Notre Dame beating Oregon on the road with a 10-point margin of victory, that would be the number one team in the country right now. And there would be Ohio State 2 and Indiana, if they had the brand recognition of Notre Dame, be at number 1 in the country. But now it's hard to watch when you have that whole brand recognition on top of that. But before I dive into the Big Ten championship game a little bit more, it's the BYU Texas Tech matchup. It's how do you get 2 Big 12 teams in? And the question is, how bad does Texas Tech lose? Because BYU's only loss, ladies and gentlemen, is to Texas Tech. You beat them, you revenge your loss. So basically, it wipes out that loss pretty much convincingly. And it was a bad beatdown. I think it was like 29-7. It wasn't like, oh, they lost by 3. It was a beatdown by Texas Tech. I don't think you could skate around the idea where it was like, oh, it was close. They get another matchup and it swings. It was a clear domination by Texas Tech. And if BYU can dominate in that same fashion, you're on the point of literally switching teams for a bye almost. And Texas Tech might get bumped down and Oregon moves up. Like that's what we're talking about here, where it's like the playoff might swing. There's a lot of things that we're trying to figure out on top of that. And it just makes it more and more impressive of what we got going on in the Big 12. I want to see 2 Big 12 teams get in there, but we don't want to lose Texas Tech, who have a fantastic year, and their only loss. They're only a 1-loss team. Like, again, this begs the question, does it hurt to play your conference championship game? Like, I think we're just going to sit there and stare, where it's like, I play this one extra game. If I'm not undefeated, being a 2-loss team, depending how I lose, could kick me out. But we saw it with Oregon being undefeated playing Penn State, and Penn State got their second loss. And they still got into the college football playoffs. So it's stuff like that where we have to figure out, where does that loss move you? Does that second loss for Texas Tech shift them down towards number 8? Does it put them number 5? Does that put them number 7? Like, where does this reside for them. Like they get the 10 versus 7 matchup, moving down 3 positions, but then you got to move BYU up a huge chunk. Like, how does that look on paper? Like, the more you break it down the details, the worse it gets for the confusing headache of which team goes in, who loses, and that forth. But let's look at the let's play the hypothetical scenario for a little bit now, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to look at the college football rankings, not the schedule. Let me see if I can get college football playoffs for the rankings. But yeah, like I'm looking at the schedule, ladies and gentlemen. Let me get a share the screen to give you what we're kind of like dealing with on the whole playoff implication, like to give you a picture of what we're dealing with here. Now, if we take a look at Texas Tech, where it sits, and they lose to BYU, let's be kind, and they only move down 4 positions. And Alabama loses the SEC championship game. That opens up the 9 spot, which what will end up happening is Notre Dame will move up to 9, and Texas Tech will play Notre Dame, and Texas Tech would have the home field advantage, and Notre Dame has to go on the road. With that scenario happening, where does that put BYU winning that matchup? They're sitting at number 11, and you have, conference champions take 12 and 11. With BYU where it sits, I honestly do not know where they kind of fall. So with Texas Tech losing, let's say, well, that the more I look at this scenario, ladies and gentlemen, the weirder it's starting to get, but it has some logic to it. We're doing a hypothetical right here. Big Ten championship, Ohio State wins, and Georgia wins the SEC. So that basically locks in 1 and 2. The question is, for Indiana, how bad do they lose to Ohio State? They have the head-to-head to Oregon, and you cannot put Oregon ahead of Indiana. Like, does Indiana just drop down to 4? But let's say it's a blowout, like Ohio State dominates 56-6 or to 7 or even to 9 or 10. But just look at it. Oregon is sitting at large. Depending how embarrassing the loss is, it impacts Oregon. On top of that, it opens up the field a little bit. So we're going to say Ohio State, Georgia win. So that's our 1 and 2. You move up A&M to 3. Your 4 is a discussion between Indiana and Oregon. And you have the head-to-head, and Oregon's only loss is to Indiana. And their only loss is to Ohio State, and Oregon did not play Ohio State this year. So I don't know how the committee is going to break that apart. Maybe they just leave Indiana at 4, and that's it. And then at that point, Oregon will get a rematch against Indiana in the quarterfinals, which I don't think people are going to be too upset about. So let's going to keep it with that so we don't drop Indiana too far. But the question is, you're going to get punished for playing your conference championship. And sometimes the committee is brutal about moving you down after losing your conference championship game, ladies and gentlemen. So we're going to put that there. Anna moves up to 3. Indiana 4 with them losing the Big Ten championship game, which will leave Oregon at 5, which then starts moving Oklahoma up to 7. Well, yeah, I would say, Oklahoma would end up moving up to 7. Oh, man. Maybe I messed up the rankings a little bit. Oh, man. Because Ole Miss is 6, and the only loss is to Texas. Oh man, this is why I'm not the part of the committee, ladies and gentlemen. Even though we can try to get this right, I think we are in a spot that's not easy to decipher because I don't think you can move Old Miss up, but it's that loss to Texas that's hurting Texas A&M. I think you can move them up because if they didn't lose to Texas, they would be playing in the SEC title game, and Old Miss wasn't in that position. So I think you move A&M to 3. I think I like that idea, jumping them over Old Miss with the whole head coach situation. But at the same time, does losing your head coach impact your seating as well? Because we saw that what happened to Florida State. You lose your quarterback and you're out, even though you had an undefeated season. So does losing your head coach have the same magnitude and you don't get to move up to get a bye to the quarterfinals? So let's leave Old Miss at 6 and you move up A&M to 3. So then you move Oklahoma up to 7. Alabama falls out. Then you pull up Notre Dame ends up moving up to 9. Moves up to 9. Yeah, yep. Notre Dame moves up to 9. And then Miami comes in at 10. But then BYU lost. Then who's in 13? I think that's Texas, ladies and gentlemen. If the rankings serve me right, Texas is 13. So if BYU loses, you pull up Texas from the grave. And is that enough for them to get in? They have their losses, but they beat Texas A&M. Oh my goodness, lazy Joe. We might have discovered something where Texas could get in depending, but it's their loss to Florida that's hurting them. If they were a 2-loss team, I think it's easier to finesse Texas in, even though that might be more towards an SEC bias. But outside of that, like, I think that's what we're dealing with here, ladies and gentlemen. Ole Miss's loss, I want to say, is to Georgia, but it was only by like 8 points. And then if we're going to look at the more head-to-head matchups, yeah, it's that Texas victory that's going to hinder Texas from getting in. Man, the SEC really put themselves in a weird situation this year in that happening. Now, if Alabama wins the SEC championship game now, ladies and gentlemen, you got a problem that's even worse. Like, the more you look at the playoff scenario, the worse, like I said, during out this entire program, ladies and gentlemen, is a headache to just break down. Because there's so many moving parts in the what if scenarios because nothing's going to be consistent because there's large implications on the teams that are playing right now. It's one of those things. I just don't know how you frame up a pretty picture where who gets in and who's locked in. You're locked in teams for the most part is nobody. No one's really locked in. I would say who's going to stay in the playoffs. We can guarantee this is Ohio State and Indiana will most likely still be in the playoffs. Same with Oregon. Oklahoma is going to sit there because they're not playing today. Same with Ole Miss and A&M. Those teams are pretty much locked into the playoff field. It's just trying to figure out their seeding, which is what's going to get people upset, ruffle their feathers, and say that the committee did a bad job. But even though we have our stance against the committee sometimes, they've normally got the 4 best teams into the field. And the best out of the 4 teams, we have a team that has a good, strong playoff run within the college football playoff era. The more we look at the teams that won the national championship, you could argue they were, if not one of the best teams in the country, at least the best 4 teams in the country. I don't think we're upset about that outside of, I would say, Florida State being left out, being down on their 3rd string quarterback at that point. But, ladies and gentlemen, it's it's tough to look at. It's tough to watch as we try to decipher of all that breakdown. But I want to get into more of a little bit of the Heisman discussion for this experience, ladies and gentlemen. The Heisman discussion is going to be broken down at the Big Ten Championship game. The Big Ten Championship game is a game that we are going to be highly anticipated with two undefeated teams. And does Mendoza get the job done and beat Ohio State? If we're looking at their Heisman odds this year, their season stats is Mendoza has about 2,758 yards passing compared to Julian Sain's number is 65,000 yards. So if we're looking at that, outside of passing yards, their stats are a little bit similar. For passing touchdowns, Julian Sain has 30 with 5 interceptions. But if you look at Mendoza, 32 touchdowns with 5 interceptions. So 2 extra touchdowns more with less passing yards altogether to get that job done. Now, if you look at their completions, Julian Sain has thrown the ball way more than Mendoza. Let's break it down. Julian Sain has threw 327 attempts, and he was able to complete 258 of those attempts. Versus Mendoza had 293 attempts, and the balls that were caught were 211. That's what we're breaking down to this discussion. But then you have Jeremiah Smith with 11 touchdowns and with 72 receptions and didn't even crack 1,000 yards this season. But then when you look at Cooper Jr. for Indiana, he has 804 receiving yards with 58 receiving attempts. Well, not attempts, receptions. So it's not close, but the thing is, Julian Sain doesn't really throw the deep ball. He liked the short game, and every once in a while, he'll throw a deep ball down the field in that matchup, which is why Jeremiah Smith will have almost 1,000 yards reception, because every once in a while, he'll throw a deep ball in his way, and he'll catch it for a big gain. But the thing that's going to hurt Indiana the most is Ohio State's defense. If Indiana can find a way to keep their drives alive and score in the red zone against Ohio State defense, they might have a shot. But the thing is, the Ohio State defense I feel like will stall Indiana on key drives to keep them in this game, and Ohio State's offense will just chip away at that Indiana defense. Keep slow drives, keep that defense exhausted, and keep them on the field as best they can. But if Indiana's quarterback wants to win the Heisman in this game, ladies and gentlemen, he has to have a crazy game to defeat Ohio State. He has to have lights out performance. Like we're talking like maybe 400 yards passing with 5 touchdowns in this game. Like it has to be a shootout for him to win. He has to beat Julian Sain. If he doesn't, he loses the Heisman race. That's how crazy does it sound. It's one of those weird scenarios. If Julian Sain comes out and wins this game, hands down, great game. I think he probably needs like 350 yards and 4 touchdowns. And I believe the Heisman Trophy is basically his for the most part. With doesn't crack 4,000 yards passing, but I think it would be enough to win the Heisman Trophy for being the number 2 team in the country. Again, Julian Sain doesn't have his Heisman Trophy moment yet. He hasn't impressed many people, even though the Ohio State team has been dominant all year, but that's the defense. He hasn't played behind. He doesn't have to because the defense has stayed tall. And The thing that I'm worried about the most in this playoff run for Julian Sayin is what happens when he does play from behind. When he's down by 2 possessions, can he figure out a way to win a football game? We haven't seen him really do that. Like, we've seen him trail against Michigan, but that didn't get in his head. But once the chip starts stacking up and he has 2, you know, drives or possessions that he has and he stalls, and now the opposing team is up by 2 scores, or he throws a pick six and then goes 3 and out the next drive once they get the ball back, like, that is a mental toll on you as an athlete. Like, you're like, man, this is just not going the way I need to figure out. And you're just praying to get to halftime to gather up the troops and try to make a surge in the third. But with Patricia to figure this one out, I think that defense is going to bail Julian Sayin out for key situations to give him a short field to get back in the games. I think that's what we're going to happen. But we don't see too many turnovers that this Ohio State team kind of creates because they put so much pressure on the quarterback. They don't get that many interceptions. They don't get really too many fumbles, that most part. They just play a well-sounded defense to keep teams from scoring. Like, that's what we've been seeing all year from this Ohio State defense. It's a consistent defense, and people recognize it and respect it. But then you can also look at Indiana's defense, where when they play teams, they're shutting teams out as well. So it's basically top 10 defenses going at each other. But the pure raw talent of Ohio State compared to Indiana, the talent margin is there. It's noticeable. And as a fan of Ohio State and after, attending Ohio State, there are some years where the defense is just skating by. But this is probably one of the better defenses that we've seen, if not one of the best defenses that we've seen in quite some time. I don't think that we will see the end of Indiana. They might find their way of getting to the playoffs for the most part. They might have to face Oregon again and beat them a second time. But, ladies and gentlemen, they have to deal with the Goliath. They have to take down Ohio State to get that number 1 seed. And with that number 1 seed, it comes at a cost. No matter what outcome that they get, hoping you get to the number 1 seed and Georgia wins, Alabama's out of the picture. I think Indiana could hang with Oklahoma and whoever comes in as the 9th seed. I think they could hang. If they get Miami, they probably could hang with Miami. Like, this Indiana team is a special team. They're trying to make a statement. So beating Ohio State might be in their favor, but if Georgia loses, you might get Georgia as a 9. So Indiana's hoping that Georgia wins and and Indiana beats Ohio State and they get a nice spot. And then in your semifinals, you might get Oregon, and you already beat Oregon. So you're mentally saying, we have a shot at a national championship. That's what's going through their mind. Like, if you get that seeding, they have that mentality saying, there's a shot of us getting to the national championship as Indiana, getting respect for the university and the program, and it changes that mentality for Indiana and saying they're not a basketball school. We're a football school now. Like, it's that much magnitude of them knocking off Ohio State, hoping Alabama loses, and they get a rematch with Oregon in the semifinals, beat them, national championship, and there's a good chance that they could face Georgia, and that's going to be a tall task. We know how Georgia's defense can be at times, where it stands tall and it just stalls you out. I think this is a clear test for Indiana. They have to keep their drives alive. They can't go 3 and out because all these teams in the playoffs have an offense that can score if you go 3 and out. That's the problem that they're facing. Every possession matters for Indiana. They have to clock manage it right. They got to keep the high-powered offenses off the field, but it's going to be an ugly fashion victory. They are going to be looking at ways to keep that Ohio State offense off this field. Whether they're going to run swing passes, short plays, but you got to keep the clock moving. You can't let the clock sit and stop because that's giving Ohio State rest. You got to keep pushing Ohio State. because they all year, at least the offense, has been running a slow tempo offense. They're not guns a-blazing. They're not running up the score. They're trying to have few less plays and reduce wear and tear on their athletes. That's what we're looking at, reducing that wear and tear so they can make an easier run for a back-to-back championship appearance. It's one of those things, ladies and gentlemen, that it's going to be a tempo game, keeping Ohio State's offense off the field. Don't make dumb turnovers and don't force the ball where you don't have to force it. Play smart. Try to create turnovers for your defense needs to create turnovers and play mistake-free football, and you have a chance to beat this Ohio State team. But that's like you're asking for a lot of perfects in this matchup, a lot of perfects. And maybe they get it. Maybe they're lucky. They'll get that perfect experience where everything goes their way. But it's a tall task for what they are asking for, ladies and gentlemen. It's very tall to get it done. I don't think that we realize the whole scenario. The crazy thing that has me baffled about it is the matchup predictor on ESPN, according to ESPN Analytics, let's make that clear, that Indiana has a 50.7% chance of victory to beat Ohio State. Let's let that sink in for a moment. Just sit there and wait. A 50.7% chance that Indiana's going to beat Ohio State. Now you may ask, why? Is it because beating Oregon by 10 points on the road is more impressive than beating the number one team in the country week 1 and only winning by 7? I don't know what the analytics are looking at. Is it by the margin of victory is how Indiana's winning and how they're thrashing teams compared to Ohio State not really cracking 50 points throughout the season outside of, Grambling dropping 70? Outside of that, Ohio State struggled with Ohio University when they played them. Like, it was like 13-9.5. Like, it's one of those things. But Julian Sain is gaining confidence week in and week out. But like I said, if he's playing down in this game, does he keep a cool head and say, I got this, I have the best receivers in the country, and I don't have to force these balls down the field? Now, if he starts to panic and starts throwing these wild passes and trying to heave it to pull Ohio State back, which he has the ability to do, he needs to play sound football. You can't rush it. Take your time, avoid sacks, and he'll be fine in this game. But it's that predictor, that matchup predictor. So you're saying the number one team in the country is an underdog based off of ESPN Analytics, and Ohio State only has a 49.3% chance of victory over Indiana. That is a head scratcher. That is a disrespect to Ohio State, even though they have the better receiving core. The quarterback play, sure, you could probably slice and dice where you want to see it and all that stuff. But it's one of those things, ladies and gentlemen, that you just don't realize what the magnitude of that is. Being, a sophomore quarterback, being redshirted, watching your team win a national championship game, and now you have a chance to go back-to-back. There is pressure in there. There might be mental blocks throughout Julian Sain's game today, but he has to stay cool. Play the game that he's been playing all year. Go through your progressions and just keep marching down that field. You don't have to rush. Control the tempo. Control the clock. Indiana will play panic. They know that Indiana can do a 2-minute drive, but they can also blunder and almost lose that. Again, the Penn State game. Ohio State, when they played Penn State, halftime score was 17-14. And it was basically a pick six or a short field, which gave Penn State that touchdown. Outside of that, it could have been a lot less. It could have only been a touchdown. So that's where the Big Ten championship game is. The Big Ten championship game, like I said, ladies and gentlemen, is the Heisman watch game. Is it enough to win? Does winning the Big Ten give you this award? Is it Jeremiah Smith? If he has 200 yards receiving with 3 touchdowns, that might be enough for him to win the Heisman. Like, it is the Heisman game. And you just can't get better than it watching at 8 p.m. Eastern time on Fox. And the spread is OSU -4. So do with what you will with that information, ladies and gentlemen. But now let's look at the glorious SEC matchup of Alabama and Georgia, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know what we're going to do with this matchup. This matchup, ladies and gentlemen, every time that these two schools go up against each other in the SEC title game, Alabama, I believe, has been 4-0 in the SEC matchups when they played Georgia. Does Kirby Smart finally beat the elephant in the room to beat Alabama? Is it enough? Is it enough to keep the number 3? That magnitude in Atlanta, they've seen it happen. They've seen the comebacks in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. I've seen the stadium in person. I haven't been inside yet, but one of these years I will be inside that stadium and we'll take the beautiful pictures that it serves it right. But I've been on the outside, and boy, it's a massive stadium, and it's a beautiful stadium to look at when you get a chance. It's very close to the Atlanta Hawks Stadium as well, so beautiful time when I was in Atlanta last year, just touring around and having a time of my life while I was down there. But ladies and gentlemen, Georgia is a -1.5 going up against Alabama. But the match predictor for ESPN, according to ESPN Analytics, great source, by the way, from ESPN, depending on how we look at it, unless they can't calculate, some things. But it gives us a step in the right direction of what the analytics are looking at. Alabama already has the head-to-head matchup because they already played, and I want to say that, Alabama ended up winning. The score was 24-21, won by 3. And Alabama at the time was number 17 and Georgia was 5. Now you have a discussion on your hands, ladies and gentlemen. What does that look like for the remaining parts of the SEC? It's one of those things you just can't wrap your head around. And Alabama's only 2 losses, ladies and gentlemen, was to, you got Oklahoma, and who else was their loss to? Florida State at the beginning of the year. That Florida State loss looms large at 31-17, ladies and gentlemen. That's a huge loss week 1. But again, I think we're going to have a common analogy here where it wasn't the same team and there was progress made by this Alabama team. And they might just drift to number 10 and lurk in. That's what we're looking at. But I think a 3-loss Alabama team gets bumped down. And it doesn't look pretty for that most part. And again, where does that put BYU if they lose to Texas Tech today? Like, there's a lot of question marks that we still have to decide within the hour. Well, not within the hour, within the next 16 minutes before the Texas Tech and BYU kick off at noon, ladies and gentlemen. But we got to figure this out now. We're going to try to be the first to do it, but it's not going to be an easy task of just breaking down the magnitude of this painful game of the SEC that we got going on right here. It's that Florida State loss and that Oklahoma loss as well. I mean, Georgia Tech giving Georgia a run for its money to 16-9. Like I said, ladies and gentlemen, it is one of those things that you just don't know what you're going to deal with because Georgia can't go any lower than Old Miss because they already beat Old Miss. So it's how much shuffling around are we going to see within the playoff format? But what does, ladies and gentlemen, Alabama look like for losing? I know we talked about it earlier and all the magnitude of it, but it's just one of those things that kind of impacts a lot of things for the college football playoffs. It impacts Notre Dame, it impacts Miami in that scenario, but also the ACC championship game impacts Miami as well. So there's a lot of things at stake that impact the lower half, but the upper half is just moving teams around and seedings and all that stuff. I think if you can get in and you're moving into a different seat, it's just how bad your punishment is and what the committee values a good punishment in the terms of in the conference championship. I think what we should rename the conference championship week, ladies and gentlemen, is to punishment week. I think that's more appropriate for the conference championship game. It is punishment week. And if you're the two teams that play, may God have mercy on your soul. That's how big this is going to be for the conference championship game, ladies and gentlemen. I just don't know how you wrap your head around it. I want to say, oh, you play and get in, and that's fine. But you need to be an undefeated team. You can't be a 2-loss team going to conference championship weekend. And if you lose, you basically get eliminated from the playoffs, and it's not your fault for playing a conference championship game. You get punished for playing, and that's what we should change it. It is punishment week. It's not conference championship week. It's punishment week, and we see that now. And going into play that game, if you're not Notre Dame, there's a bias about playing your conference championship game, which brings back to my argument. Do you purposely lose rivalry weekend if you're playing an in-conference rival? You lose it. You don't play your conference championship game, but you sit as a number 7 and you get a nice, matchup in your favor to win your first round playoff game. You get a home playoff game, and you're undefeated and you don't play in your conference championship game, and you have that one loss at the end of the year and you get left out of your conference championship game. That's what happened to A&M, and now they're not going to get eliminated. Their only losses to Texas on that front, but they can't go higher and they can't go lower. Like they're kind of locked where they're at unless things shuffle around. But like it's that loss to Texas that hurt them. And A&M's argument, they got no defense. They really have no defense. And we saw that happen, and Texas exposed them for it. They played games way too close, but that offense can score. As soon as that offense starts to stall, ladies and gentlemen, it's a wrap. That Texas A&M team, gone. It's out of there. And that's what happens. They can put up points, but they can't keep teams at bay, ladies and gentlemen. That's what A&M's dealing with. Alabama, Georgia, I don't think you can disrespect it. But they're with the match predictor indication, Alabama has a 51.1% chance of victory compared to Georgia with a 48.9% chance of victory in this SEC matchup, ladies and gentlemen. It's to that magnitude of what we got going on into this weekend. And that will kind of table up for the SEC championship game, ladies and gentlemen. So many hypotheticals. I do want to touch a little bit more about the ACC championship game, ladies and gentlemen. But it's one of those things that there's not too much implication. It's Virginia's spot to lose and makes it difficult for everybody watching that game. And that game is at 8 p.m., like I said, ladies and gentlemen. But I kind of want to talk about, the conference experience, because during my time at Ohio State, I did have the opportunity to go to at least 2 of the 4 Big Ten championship games that Ohio State was able to attend. My freshman year, I bought the wrong ticket package. I got the ticket to the game, but they said, "Oh, you can't ride the bus up." I'm like, "What do you mean? I put my name in the lottery to get tickets to go," and they're like saying, "You got to find your own way to go up there." So I had to get rid of my ticket. And then the next year, they're saying, "Oh yeah, if you went through the lottery system, we'll give you a bus ride up." I'm like, that that would have been nice to know the first time around. Like, it's my first time at college. Don't know what ticket package to get. Don't know if there's any other packages. I'm like, maybe I go through the lottery system and they have a bus ride up there. Like, that's what I was thinking. Being a freshman out there, like maybe I could have reached out to an upperclassman that I was a mentor with, get his perspective. But at the same time, I'm a freshman at college. What am I supposed to know? I never been to a conference championship game. So the next year, my sophomore year, Ohio State goes back. I get my opportunity to go. Beautiful experience. That's how I ended up meeting a lot of the guys that helped me eventually get into podcasting. And there was like Dr. Pepper tasting. You could do little activities. And we had a great time. But the thing about the conference championship games, especially the bigger ones, you have to reserve seatings at restaurants if you want to eat at the restaurant. That was a thing that I didn't know going up there. Like, again, my first, time being in Indianapolis for a conference championship weekend, and you try to go into any, restaurant. I wasn't 21, so I can't be like all just standing at the bar. Like, I kind of need to sit down and get a table. Like, that's where I was at. But me and my friends that I ended up meeting there, that I was in Block O North with, we get to the stadium early enough. We get food and have a good time and have a great time in that year. And then my junior year, we go back again for a third straight year. Nice little different experience, but I've done a lot of the interactions before, and it's just there to have a good time. I was there with another friend of mine. Overall, good experience. It's just packed of just getting around, but there's just so much fan fest going on. And for me, being in Columbus, Ohio, it's only a 3-hour drive. And since this game is always late, in theory, if I wanted to, I could always drive there. And by the time I get there, it's at the perfect window of just going there to walk around and just people watch. Obviously, I can't get really a spot into the bars, but maybe one of these years, if the longer I stay in Ohio and Columbus for, I might make the trek out again and just enjoy. I might not go to the game, but just experience it across the board. Because it's been, like I said, my senior year, Ohio State went in. Because of COVID, I couldn't go. So, like, the COVID year took away from my, third appearance of being at a Big Ten championship game. But it's one of those things where you get that experience and have a great time watching it. But, ladies and gentlemen, just looking at the overall ticket price to get into these conference championship games today. So the Texas Tech BYU game, lowest ticket, I'm guessing it's for one. Don't know if it includes taxes and fees. ESPN saying it's as low as $73. Not bad. I would say if I was in that area in Arlington, Texas, I would definitely, pick it up and go to that game. The MAC Conference Championship, ladies and gentlemen, in Detroit, which is a 3-hour drive for me from in Columbus, where Miami, Ohio, and Western Michigan play. The lowest ticket is $18 to get in. Like, for me, that is beautiful. Like, this is why I was talking about last week. If I was supporting the MAC conference, me getting to the conference championship game is actually worthwhile. It's a perfect day trip. It's at noon, and I have to get up at like the crack of dawn at like 8 a.m. to give me a fighting chance to get into Detroit. But in reality, I probably have to leave my apartment at like 7 a.m. to get into Detroit around like 10 for a noon matchup. And by the time the game is done, it's like 3:30. And I can just sit around Detroit, go to a restaurant to watch the SEC game, or if not, just drive back to Columbus, and I'm back at 6 o'clock or 7, rolling into the Big Ten championship game. In theory, I could make it a whole day affair. It's probably like from Detroit to Indianapolis might be a 4-hour drive. But let's see that real quick, ladies and gentlemen. If I had to do an aggressive road trip to there, Detroit to Indianapolis. It's about a 4 hours and 13-minute drive. So that's technically doable. But it would put me in a weird situation, though. So let's assume the game is done at like 3:30 and I leave that game. I would then drive down to from Detroit to Indianapolis. That puts me at 7:45, let's say. Game's at 8. I gotta find parking. So I'll probably miss opening kick to get inside that game, but technically it is doable. Probably could leave the MAC game a little bit early to make the trek down to Indianapolis type of scenario. Unless if I had my own private jet, then I just fly out of Detroit and then I just go into Indianapolis. That's if I had money, ladies and gentlemen. At that point, I'd probably have a Gulf Stream and probably would fly because I would see myself getting my own pilot license to fly myself, so I don't have to really rely on a pilot. But maybe in my lifetime, I'll own a private jet and I'll be able to do that. But that might be later in my career, and that might be miles down the pathway. But continue with the other ticket prices for the conference championship game. Lowest price for the SEC at the moment, ladies and gentlemen, is $275. Again, I don't know if taxes are included for that or additional fees, but that's what ESPN's telling me. For Indiana and Ohio State, the lowest ticket price, which probably shouldn't be that high, but yet it is, $568 to get into that game. That is way too expensive for that magnitude, but it is a 1 versus 2 matchup, so I understand the price with that. But at the same time, that's hurting the casual fan trying to get in that may not have that high paying job. Like, we need to rethink about ticket prices because the typical fan shouldn't be forking almost $1,000 to try to get in. Like 300 might be reasonable, maybe 400 depending on what it is, but almost $600, and that's on the low end. Like, imagine like you trying to get your family to go to, you're dropping over almost $3,000 or 4,000. That's like a family of 4 trying to fly to Europe, if not more. Like, just let that sink in. Like, it's higher than that. I shouldn't say a family of 4 because I'm not trying to do a Jet 2 holiday right here. But if you look at the ACC game, and that's in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the Panthers play, it's $20 to get in. Like, ladies and gentlemen, we need to figure out this ticket pricing because us sports fans, if we don't have the budget to get in, we're not going to these games. It's the fans that have more money going to these games. We need to maybe create a petition for lower cost tickets for the average fan to be able to enjoy and support their team in a championship game. When I saw the MLS Cup happen in Columbus a few years ago, for that match, the final was about like $250. I'm like thinking $250 for a cup final and a major professional sport. That's kind of like a no-brainer. Like, I would go to that. Like, and with how the Crew Stadium's set up, it's like 20,000. So no matter where you sit, you get a good seat of the field. So like that price alone, that is fine paying. But if I'm start paying like $500 to get in, and that's on the lowest seat, like, I guess. But if I'm trying to bring like a significant other or some friends, you can't really buy individual tickets to try to keep them sit together. Like, one friend has to fit that bill and get Venmo'd that money. Like, please, please, people who do the tickets, make it work so us casual fans can get that experience. So we can say that we've been to championship games. Some people can go without a problem, but if you don't have that luxury, you may never see a conference match, final, whatever, unless you're in school and they give you discounted rates. Like, we need to get this fixed now, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know what we have to do to get that done, ladies and gentlemen. But we got 2 minutes to the hour of the remaining part of conference championship weekend to go through. But I would say it's going to be a little bit tricky for Gridiron Gridlock coming up to the playoffs, especially next week because we got the Army-Navy game. And then looking at the whole playoff discussion, where the teams sit, we might make it a shorter show based off what's going on because I don't think the bowl games kind of start right off the bat. So I'll talk with Nick to see if we want to run a little bit of a shorter program. But we'll keep you posted on that, where that ends up standing right there, ladies and gentlemen. But thank you so much for what we got going on. Great slate of games. If you're already at your local bar listening or driving to your local bar before it starts, because I know it doesn't always start at noon, it might be 12:15. But sit there, find your beverage, get your favorite appetizers, You're in for a great, wonderful day of college football and games riding on playoff berths and playoff rejections. So thank you so much for tuning into this week of Gridiron Gridlocks, and we'll catch you next time here on ETB, ladies and gentlemen, and as well as Gridiron Gridlocks. Catch you next.